Thank you so much for joining our Knowledge Series session, another Saturday with you. I hope that you all doing well and you have a fantastic morning so far or evening. Let us know in the chat who we have in the house today. We're gonna wait a couple of minutes so that everyone can join us in. We had over 170, 80 people registered, so we're gonna give a couple of minutes so that everyone can come and join us and we can welcome them. So that's really great and interesting. I can see Amber Scott in the session today. That's awesome. We have Prem, welcome. Jennifer, nice to see you, everyone. Jacqueline, good morning. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. If this is the first time you're joining our Knowledge Series session, feel free to let us know. We would like to welcome you. We have a great and amazing community here, and we always look to welcome the people who join us for the first time, and we want to welcome you as well. So please let us know if this is the first time you're joining us on the chat, and let us more about who you are, what you do, so that everyone in the community get to know you and can welcome you. That's great. For those who don't know me or this is the first time joining in, my name is Suzan Ismaili. I'm the founder of TCAE. I have been in regulatory and financial crime compliance for the past 16 years and worked both in the Middle East and in Canada now. Around less than 2.5 years ago, I started TCA, which stands for Toronto Compliance and AML Enterprise. We focus on three main areas in our business. One is training, and this is where all of you are here today. We have our consultancy arm, and as well we have recruitment. So feel free to follow us on LinkedIn or follow us and get us connected through our LinkedIn account or other social media, and let us know how we can help you and support you. And today's session, we are so happy to have an amazing speaker who came to us last year with Karen Crane, had a wonderful session, and we wanted him to come back, and he gladly accepted our invitation and came back to share with us his thoughts about sampling. And I know this is a very interesting topic for many of us who have been in second line and have done so many work on the testing, validation, and I'm sure that this is going to be a very insightful session for you. So without further ado, let me introduce you and let us get to know more about Saad. Welcome to our Knowledge Series session, Saad. We're so happy to have you back. Tell us more about who you are, what you do, so everyone can get to know you more.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. My name is Saad Kiani, as you've already said, and it's great to be here. Happy to see some familiar names, Amber, Pavan. Sorry you don't get the daily trivia anymore. That's something we started during COVID in my team. I send out a daily trivia every day on my phone, and Pavan was part of that. Before we get into anything, though, I just want to say, man, it's been a crazy 2 years. I didn't think we'd still be in this situation after 2 years, and wherever you're from in the world, maybe we've all gone through a lot. So whatever you have gone through, maybe you've lost relatives, family to COVID, friends, maybe you're dealing with your own other issues. Maybe like many of us, you're watching what's happening in Ukraine and concerned and worried about that. So I'm holding space for everything that people have been going through and will continue to go through. And hopefully for the next hour, we can relax, take a breather, learn something new together. I'm looking forward to learning from you as well. You can throw your questions in the chat and we'll work through them. And I hope we have a great session, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it. As for a bit of my background, I'm sitting here in Mississauga, Canada, and I have been in compliance now for a lot longer than I thought I would be, about 12, 13 years. I started out in a credit card company giving advice, very traditional kind of Can we do this? No, you can't. Yes, you can. I did a bit of AML. I moved to a big bank in Canada doing same thing, advice and issues management for all the different kind of retail loans and credit cards and deposit products. And that's where I started doing my own monitoring and testing more so. And then I moved to another bank where now I lead the testing program for all of the Canadian operations of BMO, Bank of Montreal. So that's why I pretend I can have a little bit of expertise in this topic. And hopefully some of what I have learned will be useful for you and resonate and be applied practically. All right. So that's my intro.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Thank you so much. That was really lovely. Okay, I think before we start, we would like to, set the scene for anyone who wants to know about what really sampling is about. I know that, we have been talking about, and the topic of the session is about, going deep dive in sampling. But let's start, what is sampling? And if you can elaborate on that.
Sure. So the best way to look at it is, and I think I have a slide on this later, but it's like when you do a political poll, right? You're trying to figure out who's leading in the presidential election, who's going to win. So you ask 10,000 people, 5,000 people what they think, right? Because you can't ask everybody in the country. So that's what you do, and you hope it's representative, and there's an error factor. Same thing with how it applies to compliance is you have to check, let's say, KYC on your accounts. You might not sample because for KYC, it has to be 100% certain. But for other things like were all trades settled T+1, okay? All stock trades were settled the next business day and signed off by a supervisor. You might not check every single one, so you'll take a sample, right? You say, okay, we'll check 30%, we'll check 5,000, whatever the number is. There's ways you can work it out. There's methodologies, things like that we'll talk about. But the idea is to save time and effort and to be reasonable, that if you sample properly, you don't have to check every account for everything. You can get a very, very solid approximation of how healthy your population is by checking a sample of the population.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's really important. I think, with the amount of work that we have to do as in compliance work, having to select a few, it's definitely can help us adjust the resources and time and everything that we want to do. Awesome. And can you tell us more if sampling can be used in AML? Can it be used on, let's say, ABC? Can it be used on regulatory compliance part? Is it a specific sampling that we have to think about? Is it does it apply to a specific area?
No, it doesn't. You can use it. You can and should use it in all of those areas. Depending on your risk profile, you may use it less in certain areas. So again, if it's AML and it's KYC, you may say, no, we need to be 100% certain that everybody's name and identity is verified. You might still do a sample later on to say, hey, at the end of the year, at the end of the month, or end of the week, let's just make sure that X number of those were processed correctly. You might do a separate check on that, right? So you have like a first line check and then a second line check. Second line might sample more than first line, but you can use it for anything. Privacy, disclosures, trades, all types of things.
Sounds great. Sounds great. And I think my last question before we start off is that why do we use this title for the session? We mentioned that, like thinking about not breaking our back or the banks. That was really a catchy phrase that we use. Why do you think that this is important?
And while we're doing that, I'll share my screen and bring up the presentation. And that is very important because at the end of the day, that's what you're going to be asked about, right? Which is by your leadership, is how much time and money are we spending on this compliance program, okay? So you don't want to be in a space where you put up a whole compliance program You hire all these people, whatever it is, 5 people, 50 people, 100 people, whatever. And your sampling methodology is it's weak. So you're not finding anything. At the same time, you don't want to hire all these people and have them checking 100% of everything all the time when you could use sampling to be 98, 95% certain and save yourself a lot of effort. So there's no point beating yourself up, and there's certainly no desire from anybody to spend tons and tons of money on compliance processes. So it's best to have a good, robust sampling process.
That's awesome. Perfect. Okay. I think I can stop asking you questions and let you start the session.
Rock and roll. Okay, so as I'm speaking, if you have questions, pop them up in the chat. I'll try and keep tabs on them. If I can't, I'm sure Susan will flag some for me and we can go from there. So, our title, we've talked about me. And look, why do you want to build your sample properly, right? And these are some things you don't want to hear. You don't want to hear your test result was clear because your sample was too small to find anything. You might hear that from a regulator. You chose such a large sample was a waste of time and resources. And yeah, you know what, you found something, but your sample wasn't statistically significant and very small, so it was just by chance. And I've heard all those things in my career, so that's how I've come to how I do sampling today. So population versus sample, right? Just a basic. The population is a total group you're looking at. The samples are the individual items, accounts that you select for further review from the population. So you might say, all my credit card accounts open in calendar 2021. That's my population. But depending on the size of your institution, depending on what factor you're looking at, like if you're looking at transactions, that might be an insane number to look at, right? Like all the transactions for all credit card accounts. So you might refine your population to say all cashback elite credit card accounts with a non-sufficient funds fee charged in 2021. And then you could sample from there, right? And see, you could say, you know what, we still had so many. So we looked at NSFs other than $40, which is our standard fee, perhaps, charged in May and June of 2021. That might still give you enough to look at what happened with the accounts that weren't charged $40, charged 0, charged 29, charged whatever, all right? And obviously C could be seen as a sample of A, but you can go either way. So my question would be, maybe put up in the chat, of these three, based on kind of your institution, your experience, what would you choose? Any thoughts, any preferences? If not, no big deal. Well, I generally always choose kind of, not always, but based on my size of institution, BMO's large, I always kind of wind up starting with B, right? And then getting more specific if I need to with C. It's really hard after a certain size to look at all the accounts. But you can if you have a smaller business or a certain subset of something you're looking at. So once you sort out what your population is, how are you going to sample? One topic that used to be kind of all the rage when I was doing compliance, when I first started doing monitoring and testing, was statistical significance. Now, I'm not a statistician, so I'm not going to try to go in depth into what it is, but this is like what I talked about earlier, where you have a poll of who's winning an election, right? So you say candidate A is leading by 5%, poll has a plus minus of 4 points. We polled 5,000 people, and there's like a 95% confidence interval. So you're 95% certain that you have this range of error, so your result is therefore representative of the whole population. So Statistical significance is the claim that a result from data that you got from a test or an experiment is attributable to a specific cause. So you can say, we know the whole population out there is this. We looked at enough of the population, we looked at enough of a sample that the behavior we see here can be assumed or attributed to the rest of it. All right. Now, there's many articles and white papers and things on how to do statistical significance. People have books and PhDs. Make your life easier. I use an online calculator. If you want to go this route, I'll talk a bit about why you would or wouldn't, but I am not saying that you have to, all right? But I will give you some examples. So if you have high volumes of data and situations where certainty is more important, like AML, like KYC, you should be thinking about the statistical significance, okay? And a real example from my career was at one of the banks I worked at, the chief, we all got called into a meeting room one day. Well, not all of us, but many of us got called into a meeting room one day. And we were told that the chief risk officer of the bank was unhappy or did not feel that the AML KYC pass rate was high enough. We were operating at maybe 90% accuracy, and he wanted it at like 99, okay? So we had to shut down account opening for at least 2 weeks. And it wound up in actuality being a month because we had to redo our entire methodology. And that's a real example of where this kind of thought came into play. You know, we were not checking enough accounts to know that we really had certainty with how our process was working. It said we were 90% accurate, but when we looked at what we were checking, the chief risk officer said, you're not even checking enough to say that you're at 90%. So first of all, he said, I don't believe you're at 90%. So I need to get you to 99%. In this example, I put up two populations. You have a population of 20,000, a population of 200,000, right? Margin of error is 5%. We just said we want to be 95% confidence, but just look at the difference. Your sample size is 377, but if you make it 10 times higher, your sample size only goes up to 394, right? So when you have large volumes of data, large number of accounts, it's important to look at the right sampling approach. Sampling 25 or 40 isn't going to help you, but sampling 10,000 is also probably unnecessary. If you can scientifically and statistically say that we're good at 95%. Now, obviously, if I had changed this number to 99%, that would have gone up. But I wanted to show you that after a certain point, statistical significance can become your friend, because as the population gets bigger, your sample size doesn't go in a linear fashion, right? So don't be afraid of it. It is something that you can work with. So examples where I would consider this would be, again, KYC, unless somebody says you have to be at 100%. You know, you might have to check them all for certain things. But again, if you're doing a daily monitoring of KYC, of T+1 trades, of perhaps suspicious transactions, but you know, maybe you want to be more cautious with those. Maybe you have a higher threshold for those. You can use statistical significance to get to your sample. Now, I will say on a daily basis, I do not use statistical significance. I live in a testing world. In testing, particularly in what I do, and in audits, the populations are sometimes smaller, okay? So what's the difference between monitoring and testing? I'll just cover that for a second. Monitoring is a repeatable activity that might be done on the same type of transaction, the same type of data over and over, whether it's daily monitoring, monthly monitoring, you know, any type of things like that, right? Daily monitoring. Simplest monitoring, does the cash reconcile at the bank at the end of the day, right? At a given branch, you know, we're, like I've said before, all the trades T+1. But testing, we're coming in and we're looking more at the whole process of something. We might be examining the policies and procedures. We're looking at the reports that were sent to management. We're looking at the controls that have been logged, past issues. So we're not necessarily looking at a detailed transaction. So we might have a situation where our population might be 100 or 300, or sometimes only 10 accounts, right? To check, to get statistical significance for 100 accounts, you need to check 80, right? That could be a lot of work. For 365, it's 188. You know, depending on what the test is, that might just be way too much work, because a test can be a much broader scope, right? Looking at all the policy procedures, looking at the different accounts and exceptions in the reporting. If you need to look at 80% of everything, it's going to take you forever to get through it. So what has happened is there have been different kind of standard sampling methodologies that were developed. And your organization may have them. If you don't, a quick Google search will throw you up something like this, okay? This is a standard audit table where on the left, you have the nature of the control. Is it manual? Is it automated? In the middle, you have the frequency of the control. Does it happen many times per day, every day, weekly, so on and so forth? And that gives you the sample size. So it gets, it's pretty easy on the annual. If the control is performed annually, your sample size is 1. Right? You're going to check it 1. That's 100% of the population. There's no sampling involved. If it's quarterly, it means 4 times a year, you're going to check 2. That's pretty good, 50%. So if it's a quarterly report that you're reviewing or a quarterly, dashboard, checking 2 out of 4, pretty certain. Now, if it's monthly, you're checking only 2. If it's weekly, you're checking only 5. This is where it can start to get a little bit questionable. You're checking 2 out of 12. Depending on what it is, you may need to check more, right? Weekly, 5 out of 52, right? You may need to check more. And this is the key. It's a minimum sample size. A lot of times, people make it a default. The table says 2, I'm checking 2. And I have this conversation with my staff repeatedly. One example is someone said, Saad, I don't know, what should I choose as the sample? If I use, should it be 8 or 11? And I said, what's the population? They said, it's 14. I said, just check all 14. Why are we even having this conversation? It's going to take more time to choose the sample, to save the evidence of the sample and the rationale. Just check all 14 and we're done. It's going to take you half an hour. Let's move on. So don't fall into that trap of following these just as defaults. Now, at BMO, we also have an additional layer, which is the risk of the regulation, okay? So if it's a high-risk regulation, many times per day goes from 25 to like 40. Daily goes from 25 to 40, weekly goes up to 12, things like that. Just to say, if the regulation is high risk, it might go up more. Obviously, that's a whole separate conversation on risk methodologies and things like that. So, okay, let's say you're in these situations, you've got a control, like a daily account review or a weekly reconciliation report that's happening, and you want to do a sample of it. If you're looking back across the whole year at a weekly report, like I said, 5 out of 52 might not be enough. So what are some ways we can strengthen our sampling? Okay. One thing I do recommend is you can layer stuff. All right. So I'll give you an example. And this is a real example from BMO. So you have 1,000 wealth management accounts, and the number can be whatever you need it to be for your size of your institution, were flagged. 1,000 accounts were flagged for not having an annual review done with the client in a 12-month period, right? Because every year you're supposed to sit down with the client and ask about their circumstance and their objectives. So the accounts were from across Canada and managed by individual investment counselors. Compliance needs to look at the population of 1,000 and validate if there was indeed no review or if there is some evidence of a client outreach, but it's just not been logged on our system. So what's supposed to happen is, if Saad is the investment counselor, I'm supposed to call Susan every year and book a meeting. But this year Susan said she's busy, doesn't want to talk to me, and she's traveling, right? Or she's got too much to deal with. I'm supposed to put those notes into the system, but maybe I just have the emails somewhere outside. So let's look at how should we choose a sample for this review, and we can look at the sampling on slide 8. Okay, so this control happens annually for each account, but that doesn't mean you go to annual, right? The reality is it happens many times per day throughout the organization, because every day somebody's got an anniversary of opening their account, right? So at least we should be in the 25 territory. So option 1, you can just take 25 random accounts from across Canada and look at it. Great. But you know what? If you break that out, that's not a lot by region. You might have 3 or 4 from Ontario, 3 or 4 from Quebec, 2 or 3 from the Maritimes, so on and so forth, right? So what if we did take 25 random accounts from each province or region? I say region, depending on your institution, you may have a supervisory structure by region, right? You may have a prairies region, or western region, including BC, Alberta, and the territories. And we could also add in, have a limit of 2 accounts per investment counselor. This is important because sometimes you'll have all the accounts with a given region or a given person. So you want to spread it out to see if different people are causing the problem. Then what we could do, in addition to random, we could add 10 judgmentally selected accounts from each province or region. So judgment now means, instead of using a random number generator that gives us line, you have your rows in Excel of your accounts, right? 1 to 1,000. Use a random number generator to give you 25 numbers between 1 and 1,000. Then you highlight those in your Excel, and that's your random. You could also add in 10 judgmentally selected accounts. You could say, okay, who's been past due the longest? Who's been repeatedly past due? What are some accounts with big account values that don't seem to be getting a review, or biggest account value fluctuations, or time since account open? Whatever you choose, you can look through it and say, gee, that looks strange. Let me take a look. And I'm just going to, Susan, I just want to make sure I'm not able to see things popping up in the chat. Are there any questions I should, let's see. I don't know if there's any questions I should look at now. I see there's a question about AI-enabled tools. Okay,
I have 2 questions. Yeah.
Yes. So can we use AI-enabled tools to check the entire population to have 100% check? The answer is yes, you could, but it comes down to time, money, and at the end of the day, I have not met an AI-enabled tool yet that could check everything you want to check about an account. So, like in the example I've given you, you could check that, you could check that, accounts had, all the accounts at BMO who was past 12 months. That's not really AI, but it's a data tool, right? How is it done? We have AI tools in terms of, we have bots actually. So we use bots that can log, that all they do every day, all day, is they log into a system, download a disclosure from a client, check that the fields are correct, compare that to what they should be, and then give an answer of pass or fail, right? And that's what those bots do 24/7. Where bots don't work and where AI, where we're right now struggling is, it depends a lot on your data structure. And Big banks have a lot of legacy systems. The data is in many, many places. And as soon as one thing changes on the back end, your bot breaks down. You have to rebuild the bot. And that's time, and that's money, and that's software. Same thing with AI. So where I'm heading is getting access to more data, getting people who can use SaaS to mine that data better. So instead of looking at 1,000 accounts, I'm looking at 300,000. Instead of looking at 1,000 transactions, I'm looking at 30,000. And I'm able to filter and look at the oddballs, the exceptions, and sample into those. So that's where I'm heading into that. Okay. Sorry, Susan, I went a little off track there. I'll get back on track now, and then we'll save the questions as you flag them for me. So my third option, the third option is if you do flag 1,000 accounts, what about the ones that were not? Were those reviews actually done? Or did somebody just go in and be like, oh man, it's this account review was due on February 26th. It's February 25th. Let me go in and say it was done. And what's the evidence? They sent an email to the client on February 25th saying, hey, you want to talk? You know, you can add that in. So this is where I talk about the layering, right? You've created more work for yourself, no doubt. But what you've done is at least given a much bigger, better picture from across the geography and to your leadership. So the reason when I did this test, this is a real test that I did, my team did. We basically did number one, right? We added some others, but we basically did number one. We had to go back and add in a few more, but really, this is when we were told your sample wasn't, you did have findings, but your sample wasn't statistically significant. So we accept the finding, but you got lucky. So then we said, okay, we'll be back next year to retest. So that's when we started to go, let's go with number two. And now we do this very frequently. We go, okay, 25 accounts in this region. We chose different regions, and we're going to add judgmental. And we do this kind of across the board now. It is extra work. If you have the conversation up front with your staff, with your leadership, and everybody knows what's going on, then it's not incrementally that much because you're in the flow, you're in the rhythm, you have the data, and you can get other people on your team to help out, and you can manage the workflow. All right. So that's one example of how I recommend you layer your samples. Okay, let me look at another example. For another business, we have a conflict of interest check that we have to do. So if your asset management business, which creates mutual funds, if those mutual funds buy a security that capital markets underwrote, so maybe your capital markets division issues as part of an IPO. But at the end of the day, whether you're at a bank or not, if side A of the business is involved with side B, and there's supposed to be a separation between the two, how are you checking that? In this case, the asset management side will get a report from capital markets. Asset management will get data from its own staff, but also from wealth management on what purchases they made. And then asset management will use VLOOKUP in Excel to compare everything and see what matched. Okay? And any overlaps had to be reported to the board. So how do we structure this review? Because it's not just about the data, right? There's also reporting involved. So first and foremost, we had to review everything. In terms of, we had to review all the policies and procedures because it was a bit complicated. We said, okay, what are all your policies and procedures? We said, what are the quarterly reports that you've sent to the board? We chose to review all 4 because it was super quick to just look at all 4 and see if any overlapping transactions, any conflicts of interest were reported. Now, item 3, this was the meat of the test. Quarterly comparison of data to reports. So remember, they're taking this report and doing a VLOOKUP and just trying to compare. And this goes to that question of AI that was posed earlier, right? If you can rebuild their VLOOKUP analysis, if you have another model, by all means, check the whole thing, right? But if you cannot, or if you don't have the time or the expertise, we actually chose to narrow the scope. So we said, we're just going to review 1/4 of data because it is what you're saying, business is an automated process. VLOOKUP should catch everything. So, okay, should be automated. So we split the samples by the types of deal because they had given us a spreadsheet by type of deal. Canadian debt, Canadian equity, US debt, US equity. And again, this could be any type of thing. You know, it could be US trades, Canada trades, it could be US accounts, overseas accounts, whatever your institution or your business looks at. But we looked at 15 each. We selected the samples randomly at first, and then we added on judgmental. And I'll be honest, we got to a point where we were just going one by one down the list because we weren't finding anything. And we just kept going to make sure that we got to like 40, 50 accounts. And then we did find something. Because randomly checking it when it's automated, it wasn't finding these very odd situations where all that was happening was the report that was coming in, the name of the deal, it looked the same as this report. But this report had one extra space at the beginning. So VLOOKUP wasn't catching it. Okay, so my point there is you can have an automated tool that they had built in response to a previous issue. They had tested it and it was working. And we had tested with a thorough random sample. And we still didn't find anything. And we kept going, and then we just happened to find that issue. So back to the question earlier about AI and automation. You can have AI, you can have automation. I recommend you always try to have some sort of additional sanity check, manual check, because something can change in the back end. Somebody can change the way they're sending the data in on a small number of deals. And that's what was happening. Somebody's putting a space in a small number of deals and they weren't getting reported to the board. So the reporting was off and the policy and procedure was therefore off, right?
So there is a question that have been asked about the VLOOKUP. So Prem is asking, what about the error caused on account of using VLOOKUP? Wouldn't a macro enabled tool be better to be used?
You know what, it absolutely might. But this is where you're getting into the expertise of the people who are doing this, right? So this is the first line people in the business. They've built what they were capable of building. And so now they need extra help to build a macro or another tool. And this is quite frequent. Also, I also will say one of the biggest risks that we run into is somebody will automate something, build something. That person will then leave the bank, transfer to another department, or the code keeps running for years and years and years. And guess what? You wake up and there's a problem. And I know that because an institution I worked at, they had that exact process. Everything was automated going into a certain ledger. And it turned out their capital numbers were off by a significant amount. They had to restate earnings. So I agree a macro approach would be better. But this is why one of the keys to all of this is the communication aspect, right? So looking at this, if I've seen this happen with the first line, I can go back to them now and say, look, would you prefer we built a different solution, a bot or a macro? Because I do have connections within the bank who can do that kind of work if you don't, and it'll make both of our lives easier. So on a technical side, yes, the macro can certainly be better if someone knows how to develop it and knows where to go to ask for it, right?
Sounds great.
Yeah. So I have blazed through a lot of these examples. I want to look at if we have time for questions, but we certainly do. and see if people have something they wanted to bring up or talk about other types of examples. I'm happy to do that as well.
Sure. We had some great questions, so I'm going to start asking you and go through them. So I think the first one that we have been asked is that if time permits, could you elaborate on automated or IT general control sampling?
Automated or IT generated control sampling? So
general control sampling.
Oh, general controls. Okay, I thought it said generated. So if I'm thinking about the examples I was using earlier, automated or IT general controls. Okay, so if it's an automated control and it's supposed to be happening all the time, the standard is, oh, you only have to check it once because it's automated. So if you just check one sample, you should be fine. But that assumes, when people hear the word automated, they assume it's automated the same way for everything, right? The code might be automated. If it's looking at all accounts the same way, then yes. But if the code does multiple things, then you have to check multiple scenarios. Okay, so I think that's one thing around automated controls you have to be careful of. That people hear the word automated and they rely on it that, oh yeah, there's a script that checks everything. So the question is, are there controls in place to make sure changes, or is this a new question or is someone building on the previous one?
No, this is a new one.
Okay, sorry, my bad. So that's what I would say about the automated controls. IT, if you mean IT controls more broadly, when I hear IT controls, I hear like information technology controls. So I don't think that's what you meant. I think you meant the automation, like sort of an automated control, how is it being handled? But again, you have to look at what is the control designed to do? What are the scenarios where there could be breakdowns? And look at those scenarios, not just look at, okay, it's checking that, right? It's automated, so I check one and I can move on. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to another question. So Selena is asking, how do you explain the methodology behind the 3 options? I think from the example that you shared.
Okay, let me go back to that. Right, just bear with me. Oops. Okay. How to explain the rationale? So the first step, I have a minimum standard at BMO that says I have to check 25 accounts. So it's very similar to this. So I say multiple times per day, someone has an account anniversary, or daily, there's at least one account that has an anniversary at BMO. So I need to check 25. So once I've hit the minimum sample, that's your rationale. You know, we have this methodology that either audit gave us or we developed our in-house or a consultant or whatever. It's set to 25. Then after that, I say, in addition, we added 10 judgmental accounts. Why? Because we have different provinces or regions, or we have a report that flags different things or whatever. I would also say for the limit of 2 per investment counselor, things like this, you can explain it by saying we added additional samples to provide better coverage across each region, just due to the number of accounts or the number of transactions. And anytime I've used that as a rationale, I've not had an audit finding in 2 years. This will be the year I guarantee to get one now that I've said this. But I think that's how it works in my book, is make sure you address the minimum standard. And then when you're going above and beyond, it shouldn't be, you're only substantiating it more, right? You're saying there was a lot of accounts, so we wanted to go by each province or region. And then we saw some weird things. So we added 10 accounts per region to look at these exceptional cases. And then option 3 is really just about being fulsome. Like option 3 is this a whole different population. You said 1,000 accounts were flagged. Well, what about the rest? We need to look at those randomly as well to make sure they were actually done properly. It's a lower risk maybe that people are faking their results. So maybe you just take 25 accounts from Canada. But now you've got your 2 populations and a thorough test, right? Non-flagged accounts and flagged accounts, and then sampling for each of those.
Thank you for the explanation. That's great. Let's move on to Sharon's question. She's asking, are there controls in place to make sure changes are communicated to ensure changes are not negatively affected your samples?
There's always controls in place to make sure they're communicated, but I've seen them break down time and time again. So you have to assume that the controls are there. There's system logs, there's presentations and approvals and all of these things that every change should be managed, whether it's on your side or on the business's side. But you have to do a periodic check of those, right? So you may have to once a year, once a month, whatever it is, ask the question of, have there been any changes? We look at a certain account range for one of our tests, the account numbers like 300 to 600. They start with 300, or they start with 600. And once a quarter, we ask and say, listen, did anything change? It's still 300 to 600. So there's lots of controls, but somebody will forget or somebody will not think it was something that needed to be escalated. And I've worked at a bank where the CEO walked over to a coder and said, just change this. And the coder just changed it because the CEO told him to. It was a small institution. And then he went back to his desk and nobody else knew until OSFI came asking a few years later. So you always have to be ready for those types of things and review the policy and procedure, review the methodology, look for the changes, ask the question, how are these approved, how are they managed, and see what's actually happening.
Beautiful. Great. Another question from Wish was that, what are the conditions or precautions to consider before taking sampling for large data? From large data.
Okay. Number one is just technically, can you handle it? A lot of people think that because Excel has 64,000 rows in it, that you can just copy paste 64,000 rows of data and then start doing filtering. So no. But obviously, if you have the tools technology, you might have to use SAS, Power BI, ACL, any of these tools. After that, you also have these concerns of storing the data. You probably can't just store that on your C drive. You may need dedicated servers. Well, you probably will need dedicated servers if you're looking at 300,000 lines of transactions, right, in SAS. You'll need a data governance model for all of these types of things. Privacy concerns. In terms of manipulating the data, I mean, that's the technical expertise of being in SAS and what are you looking for. And it's about having that conversation between, perhaps, let's say you have a data analytics person and the tester. They have to talk to say, this is what I want. This is what I'm looking for. This is what developed, so that he or she isn't wasting time pulling all this data, manipulating it a certain way, and then you come back and say, actually, I needed this. And then they have to rerun the whole script. And again, like, server time costs money, right? Sometimes you can only run one thing at a time or X number of things at a time. So you really have to plan it out properly if you're going to be looking at large scale data, and especially if you're going to be doing it on an ongoing basis. So communicate, plan it out in the beginning. And this is especially in small institutions. When I worked at a small place, literally you had 2 or 3 people that were doing these data pulls, and they'd say, Saad, like, if we redo this, I have to stop the other job, and that's going to delay everything else. So what do you want to do here, right? So planning, communication, and of course, the technical infrastructure to support that.
Absolutely. I think it's a really, really great points you raised, communication and, planning. these are key essential points, whenever you're doing the testing and validation. And getting as well the management buy-ins on that and get their support. I think these are also important points in order to have a very smooth testing.
Yeah, and you know what, Susan, just on that, I would say discuss the sampling with the people or the business area that you're reviewing. Discuss in advance what will be a finding or an issue or an escalated item, whatever you call them. Have those conversations in the planning phase and design all of that into it, and it'll be much easier. Ask for their advice on what you should sample, look at, things like that.
Absolutely. Great. Jacqueline is asking, how often should staff be trained and the risk affiliated?
Should staff be trained and the risk?
Affiliated. So well, let's look into how often the staff should be trained.
With sampling methodology, okay, so you have your standard training, right? Onboarding, they come on, they learn the job, right? What we have started doing in my team is we have a quarterly review of everybody's tests amongst each other. And the reason for this is that the sampling methodologies don't change that often. The way to do sampling and statistical significance doesn't change. What changes is the business realities that you're dealing with, right? So that's where every quarter we review everybody's tests and we say, okay, folks, here we tried to use just 25, but it turned out that this happened and this happened. So then we added all of these things. So team, now you need to start looking at it. Or that's my chance to communicate and say, hey, our executives are all about automation now, and they want us to look at bigger sample sizes, and they want us to build bots. So how can we, first of all, until we get those things, improve our sample sizes? And we start talking like that. So, it's case by case, I would say. But in my world now, we're looking at it all the time to say, okay, is our sampling methodology effective? Do we need to go above and beyond?
Great. Awesome. A great question from Amber. I think me and you have discussed it before the call about the small, let's say, small size companies like MSPs and all. She's asking, for small understaffed team, are there any tips for maximizing the effectiveness of small samples? For example, if I only have approval to review 10 new accounts every month.
Okay. So let's work with that specific example. You only have approval to review 10 accounts per month, no more, no less. Can you use some, criteria to select certain accounts? So it's not just 10 random accounts, right? So maybe it's accounts where, okay, one simple example. We did this in AML. Any account that had the name, like our developers would put fake accounts into the production system, right? So you'd have all these accounts like Daffy Duck or Mickey Mouse and stuff like that. Any account like that, you might exclude from your sampling and just look at it, have it treated separately. So can you reduce your sample, your population, so that you focus on the effective things? So are there ways you can use data or existing analysis that these are low risk or these are not something we need to worry about? So let's focus on these. Let's say you also don't have access to a data analytics person. It's just you, right? You're the compliance person. You have to check these 10 accounts. You can start changing it up, right? If you can check only 10 accounts, look at where most of your accounts are from, right? Are they from Ontario? If Ontario is 90% of your accounts, then maybe that's where you check 8 accounts or 7, right? Someone threw a suggestion of risk rating. Yeah. What's the type of account? What's the type of regulation? What's the geography, right? Because you might have a risk rating for the geography, the reg, the type of account, any number of those things. You could look at what are some factors. Was there a recent change on the account? Was the account over limit on something, cash transactions, any type of things. So look at, can you change up the geography? I mean, meaning like, can you look at 10 from different slices of the business, whether it's geography, different businesses, different types of things? Can you use criteria? Can you use data? And is there somebody in the business who can help? You know, at one of my banks, we had one person in the business who was a data person who was able to develop a script that checked the entire population, all 1 million accounts, for one certain factor. Okay, he was just able to build that script and run it every month for that one certain factor, and that just took off that much work. So there might be some cheap wins like that, but yeah, it is tough if you're at a small institution. So that's where I would say, you know, can you look at those? I'm seeing someone with a suggestion of apart from 25 accounts, if we miss any of major red flag involved. I didn't catch that. In the 500th count, what will be the impact in that review? Okay. Sorry, but I don't know, Amber, if I answered your question or if you wanted to build on that a little bit, or if there's anything else, but I hope I got to that.
Yeah. She mentioned you killed it, so
Right, so
that's great. Awesome. We have a couple more questions. One, I think Priya wants to know if she's correct about this. The basic checks on pattern of transactions, geographical locations, purpose of transaction, and any adverse information identified that has to be narrated in comments and properly mitigated. Is she correct on this?
Well, I would say those are just those are a great set of examples that we've covered today, but I can give you more, such as you could check, like we said, any adverse information. So let's say adverse information, what's the definition? Again, if anybody's fee is not what it's supposed to be, right? If the fee is supposed to be $40 and it's 20, what's going on? If you know that the yield on a given account has to be between this percent and that percent, and it's outside of that, what can it be? My colleagues in the US who have much more prescriptive requirements about their disclosures and things, they use the bots that I was mentioning earlier to specifically go in and check that this disclosure item was checked and that item was there and that this rate matches what was disclosed. But by and large, Priya, you're right. That's what we talked about today. But depending on your business, there could be many other types of specific factors to look at.
Great. Sounds great. We have Richard asking, is there a best practice of when to determine sample size, for example, at time of test plan, at point of test execution, and etc.?
So I'm going to give a careful answer to this one. If you're looking at the way it's supposed to be done, you plan your review, you identify all the control frequency and the risk ratings and all of that, then you choose your sample size and then you execute. What typically happens with me in the real world is I do my planning, I get some P&P and a walk through the process from the business, policy procedure, then a walkthrough from the business. And I think I'm going to check 25, 40, whatever the number is. Then I get into it and I go, oh man, this is not going to work. So let me look at this. Let me look at that. Let me look at these things. So I would say try and do it at time of test plan, of course, especially if it's monitoring, right? If it's monitoring, you want it to run and repeat. So if it's monitoring, try and figure that out and do a test run beforehand. In testing or audits though, yeah, I often have to modify it as I go, right? And that's always worked out. It's sometimes somebody will come back and say, why are you asking for more information? So I'm very careful about that. I try, if I'm increasing my sample size, I don't go back to the business, or I try to avoid going back and saying, by the way, now I need all this other stuff as well. I try to get everything I need in advance and then just manipulate the sample size, the factor, versus getting more data. So yeah, Richard, just be ready that you might have to work on the fly a little bit.
That's awesome. Perfect. I think the last question that I'm gonna ask you is that what is your advice for people who want to get into to the second line into testing and validation, and what are the skills they have to develop? What are your advice on that?
For testing roles, we are very much like auditors, same like monitoring, right? We are in the business of giving people bad news quite frequently. So you do need to have a detective mindset, right? You need to be a little bit of a Sherlock Holmes, but you also have the right attitude. If you come in with the attitude of, I'm pretty much like OSFI and I can just give you findings and da-da-da-da, you're gonna have a very difficult time. But the number one thing is communication and transparency with the people who are going to be affected by what you're doing. So you don't have to have a big formal engagement letter, but you have to send somebody a note that says, we're going to do this, and this is what we're going to cover. It can be an email, it can be whatever. And if you have a finding, maybe pick up the phone and call them and say, listen, I've seen something. And don't say it's a finding, say, I don't understand it. Can you explain it to me? Right? Those types of skills are huge. The relationship building in advance, before you even plan a test, to say to meet with the executive, to meet with the head of governance, to meet with the product manager, whoever, to say, listen, this is what we're going to do. Or, gee, what do you want from this with compliance? Or what are you looking for? And they'll tell you, just please don't surprise me. Please pick up the phone and call me, because they don't want to lose their job any more than you do. But you have some common ground there, right? And this will also save you in that if you are wrong about your finding, if they can give you extra information, evidence, you've covered yourself before you put it in paper on an email, and it becomes an audit trail, and it becomes escalated and gets forwarded to other executives and things like that. So learn how to communicate, manage relationships, and keep things on the down low until you have to. I'm not saying hide stuff. I'm saying give everybody a chance to address it before it gets escalated.
That was really, really good points that you raised. That I think communication, and as well having a very honest relationship and building a great relationship with the other people who they are going to be involved, it is really crucial, because everyone sees compliance as the big bad wolves, and they're really scared when a testing comes in. I remember at Wells Fargo, when the testing team wanted to come in, everyone was so panicking and scared, and like, oh my God, we don't have the time. We have to put the time aside. What is going to happen? What would be the result? We have to get a good result. And that was a lot of pressure on a lot of people. But when the communication is there, when you sit down with all the stakeholder and you talk to them and really walk through and think that, okay, we're all in this together, and we want your success. We're not just there to pinpoint the problems. We're here to help and guide you. And I think that is a great strategy that you pointed out. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining. I hope I was able to answer your questions. I apologize if I couldn't get to some of the detail on any technical aspects or anything, but look forward to connecting with you guys and with all of you virtually. Look me up on LinkedIn, and thank you so much to TCE and Susan for organizing this session.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Always lucky to have you, Saad. Thank you for sharing all the great experience and examples that can be really, really helpful to many of us. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Another great knowledge series session. We hope that you enjoyed us. And yeah, stay with us. We're going to have another great session in 2 weeks' time. Make sure you follow TCA. Make sure you follow Saad. He's a really great asset, and we're really lucky to have him in our community. Have a wonderful day, and hope to see you very soon. Thanks again, Saad.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.